Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our second annual Future of Asia conference. I'm Terry McCarthy. I run the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. And a big thank you to all of you who came. Some of you come from a very long distance. First, allow me to thank our speakers. We have over 40 speakers. I think we're going to have a very interesting session here over the next 2 days. Thank you to our sponsors, without whom this wouldn't be possible. East West Bank, JM Eagle, Air Canada, Merrill Lynch, and Plaspro. Of course, sponsorship is the name of the game with conferences, so we're very grateful to them. And thank you also to North Korea. Some of you might have been watching CNN in the last hour or so. And if you look very closely at the footage, on the side of the missile it says, sponsored by Lawak Future of Asia Conference. It cost us about $50,000, but they're cheap in North Korea. And they'll do anything for it. So those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, North Korea just launched another missile over Japan just in the last hour or two. So let me just briefly introduce our conference before we go to our panel of 10 today. There are about 1.4 million Asian residents in Los Angeles County, where we are today. And that's by far the largest number of any county in the United States. Second comes Honolulu, in fact, and after that, San Francisco. And that's the reason why we think we're the perfect place to do a conference on the future of Asia in the United States. And this year, we're going to be looking at the subject of leadership. Those of you who came last year, remember we did the main theme of our conference was on the emerging middle class in Asia. And that, of course, has brought about a whole load of changes. The increase of wealth in Asia is really quite phenomenal. And so this year we thought we'd look at the concept of leadership. Because when things are changing, that's when leadership is really paramount. So you'll see that theme of leadership will be likely infusing most of our discussions here over the next couple of days. Asia, as you know, has 5 economies that are at 1 trillion, more or less, or above. China, of course, the biggest. Then you've got Japan, India, South Korea, and Indonesia. And if you look at them, all 5 of these economies need some pretty fundamental economic reform for different reasons, but they all need change, and hence the real importance of a strong leadership, not just political leadership, but also business leadership, corporate leadership, to come up with new models to service the changing nature of their societies. At the same time, the leadership is required also in the sort of peripheral education, healthcare, infrastructure, and security, and all of this requires thoughtful and enlightened leadership. Now, speaking of thoughtful and enlightened leadership, I should say that we decided on our leadership theme in September of last year. In November, we had a somewhat surprising result in our elections here in the United States. And so you might have noticed that we've entitled our conference Leadership in the US and Asia in a Time of Change. It will come as no secret to many of you that our current administration's Asia policies are somewhat unpredictable. Always interesting to follow the graph of the tweet spate of tweets. But of course that makes life a lot more complicated for people in Asia as they try and make decisions about their own lives going forward. And that does indeed include North Korea. During this conference we'll be looking, amongst other issues, at leadership in technology. Tomorrow we're going to show you, for example, a drone that you can fly with the palm of your hand without any electronic controls, which is a pretty cool thing. We'll be talking about leadership in business, in politics, and in the military balance of power that's somewhat volatile at the moment across Asia. We'll be looking in detail at some of the major leaders across Asia, Xi Jinping, Shinzo Abe, and Narendra Modi. And then we will have a special panel also dedicated to one of Asia's foremost leaders in the past, Kuan Yew, ironically from one of the smallest countries in Asia, but a man who had an enormous stature until he passed away in 2015. As you know, the World Affairs Council is a non-partisan organization, but that doesn't stop us from giving the forum to speakers with very divergent views and sometimes very strong views. And as Kuan Yew himself once said, I've been accused of many things in my life, but not even my worst enemy has ever accused me of being afraid to speak my mind, which will resonate with any of you who've ever met Kuan Yew. And so in that spirit, to start off our conference, we're doing something we did last year. We've asked 10 of our speakers to speak their minds as strongly as they can for 3 minutes on a subject of their choice related to leadership. And the idea is that this starts up 10 different conversations at the beginning of the conference, and I hope we'll set the tone for the forward-leaning nature of our discussions as we go through. Allow me first to introduce our first speaker, Wang Zongze, who is known probably to many of you here from his work as the Executive Vice President of the China Institute for International Studies in Beijing. And he can tell us a lot about leadership because China has been working on that for the last 3,000 years. Please come to the
Okay, I hope you can see me. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Terry. And it's always my great pleasure to be back in the States. I spent a couple of years in DC, but I don't have much time to come to LA because LA always means Hollywood. Now, from now on, LA also means the future of Asia. So that's really a great value and a great topic. What I'm going to do about in my 3 minutes or 2.5 minutes, 50 minutes, well, it's about leadership. I think leadership is a tremendous importance, matters a great deal. I think the future, when we talk about the future of Asia, certainly vision means a lot. So if you want to have a great leadership, the number one, I would say vision, whether you can have a vision or not the strong or weak leadership, but vision matters a great deal. By these criteria, I think for China, in the years to come, we will see China already started to, let's say, to craft some fine ideas, particularly, for example, by Xi Jinping. He invested enormously on the Belt and the Road Initiative. This is a kind of a vision for the future, not only for China, but also for Asia, but also for Eurasia and Africa, for many other countries. Because number one, it creates a better opportunity for growth. This is very important for China and for the rest of the world. And for China in particular, we have two things to do. Number one, we have to address the poverty issue in China. In the last over 30 plus years, China has successfully lifted 700 million people out of poverty. And still, we have about 50 million people in poverty. Xi Jinping identified the line in the next 3 or 4 years, we are going to lift all those people out of poverty. So in order to do that, you need to have international cooperation. Secondly, it is also provide opportunity to hedge any challenges and uncertainties in this world. This world is full of uncertainties and unknowns, but how to hedge and to make a better conditionality for future growth, you need to have this vision. So from my view, the Belt and Road Initiative, that represents the future and represent the strong leadership and a strong, the innovative leadership of China. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Kanak Dixit, a writer and thinker and the founder of Himal magazine, I met on a rainy day earlier this year in Kathmandu, and he talked about Nepal's history, one of the few countries, as you might know, that was not colonized by the British in South Asia, which gives them a sort of unique perspective on the region, nestled up against the Himalayas, sandwiched between two rather larger nations, India and China. And so he's going to talk about, I think, how they are vying for leadership in the region.
Thank you, Terry. Given that the topic is who will be leading South Asia, I thought to go right for the juggler and through a process of elimination present to you my little perspective from Kathmandu. First and foremost, there are cross-cutting preconditions for leadership for Asia or for anywhere else. And they would require, one, the power of projection. One is leadership, individuals. One is democratic values, which includes human rights and pluralism and social justice. And connected to that, to be a leader in South Asia for any country, in Asia for any country, you would think of size of population, because that matters. size of territory, geographical placement, whether you are in the, what you might call the periphery, or whether you're in the center, whether your society is seen to be in accelerating path or in a decelerating path to impact the image of your society, which will then link into to leadership role. So with all these preconditions and requirements, where do we stand in terms of who do we look to? And there need not be one leader, there may be many, but are there individuals, societies and individuals to look forward to? And so if you go down the list, you'll find there is indeed a process of elimination. China is ruled by a communist party. You hit problem right there when it comes to democratic values, from grassroots on to the top. You have to consider Asia as, Russia as part of Asia. Bulk of it is in Asia. Mr. Putin. You talk of Turkey, bulk of it is in Asia. Erdogan. Philippines, Duterte. And coming down to, among the larger nations, India. You would expect India with its democratic past, and it's in the modern era, and it's the values it has carried, perhaps. But under Narendra Modi, India has become deeply polarized from within. And that's a problem. No time to go into more details there on that right now. But beyond that, unlike the other parts of Asia, to carry to a leadership mantle, you also need to carry South Asia as a whole, because of the particular peculiarity of the history of South Asia. So India has not been able to thus far in Mr. Modi's rule as Prime Minister. He's not been able to do that. So then I will not go to some of the other countries, but I'll end by saying, my time is almost up. So you would have thought maybe leadership, individual ability to have a position and a record in your history. You have Aung San Suu Kyi. I rest my case.
Mihir Sharma is a columnist for Bloomberg and the opinion editor for the Business Standard in Delhi. And like Lee Kuan Yew, he's not shy about sharing his opinions with anyone, which is why we're delighted to have him speculate about leadership in India.
Thank you, Terry. Terry suggested that I look at the question, can anyone lead India? And, it sort of can. It's such a democratic and diverse place that it makes leadership look impossible. But when I thought about this question, I realized maybe we're looking at it backwards, and what we should be asking is, will India accept being led? Because in a democracy, it's people that choose and not leaders. And seen that way, the answer is yes. People can lead India, but it's not easy. As it happens, India has accepted being led at various points in the past. In fact, for the first 30 years after independence, under our first prime ministers, it seemed effortless almost. And then that broke down. And for 30 years, we've had a sort of leadership vacuum in India, which has precisely what made it look impossible and, impossible to lead. So what happened? What made it possible in the first 3 decades, and what's changed since then? I think there are two conditions were satisfied in the past, two conditions that are essential for leadership in a democracy. The first is a positive condition. And at that point, enough Indians thought that the leaders, the ideas that they stood for, and the vision that they laid out were worth supporting. And this is what puts leaders in power. And the second condition is a negative condition. All Indians felt secure enough that they would, in any event, not be harmed by these leaders, by their ideas, or by their vision. And that was what has allowed the leaders to use the power that they technically had. What happened subsequently was that the first condition went away. We couldn't find any single person who represented our aspirations enough in India to actually serve as a leader for enough Indians. We couldn't put anyone in power. Now, with Narendra Modi, for the first time in 30 years, we have put somebody actually in power. He won an absolute majority. But I fear the second condition isn't yet met. All Indians do not still feel secure enough that they will be unharmed in his vision of what the future of India holds. The question that we have to ask going forward is, will he be able to, in fact, satisfy enough Indians that his vision of the new India is inclusive enough that the entire country can get its act together and accept his leadership? Because then he can get something done. India will change and the world will change with it. Young people in India will start looking outward and become an engine of growth and innovation in the rest of the world. If he cannot, however, achieve that second condition, if he cannot convince enough Indians to go along with his vision of the future, then India will turn inwards. And I fear that the costs for reaching for leadership when you haven't convinced enough people that it's good for them will be severe indeed. Thank you.
Patricia Kim is transitioning from Princeton to the Council on Foreign Relations, where she's going to be the new Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow, which, given the way of the world today, probably means job security for the next few decades. But today she's going to talk about China's increasing leadership role around the world.
Thank you, Terry, for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to be back in my hometown of Los Angeles. The theme of this panel, Who Will Lead in Asia, is a very important and timely question, given the recent debates on whether China has surpassed the United States to become the leader of the world, with China's rising international profile and an American turn inward with President Trump's America First policy. But before we declare a winner in the competition for leadership, I think it's important to take a step back and break down what this competition entails. The United States and China generally seek the same things that most states want. They want security and prosperity for their people. But where they diverge is in the specifics and what they believe are the means to achieving these ends. So China's greatest priority is achieving what President Xi Jinping has called the Chinese dream, which is basically a catch-all phrase for boosting China's military, political, economic, and diplomatic standing around the world. And Chinese leaders firmly believe that they're going to get to this by building economic ties with other countries and pursuing what they call win-win cooperation, which basically says, we can all get rich together. But while Beijing is eager to expand its economic ties with others, it takes a completely opposite approach when it comes to security ties. And this is where it differs with the United States, which traditionally has attached much importance to its alliances and sees these relationships as a critical component of its strength and ability to project influence. So the good news is that the Chinese dream to become a regional power and the United States' will to stay active in the Asian region are not necessarily incompatible. And this is the reality already in many ways. But there will be times when the United States and China's interests clash, and the million-dollar question is, when the two great powers have opposing demands, which state will prevail and why? And I believe the state that maintains the most comprehensive relationship with other regional players beyond only military or only economic ties, that wields its power in a smart and sensitive way so as not to scare off its neighbors, and can provide answers to the most pressing problems in the region, will have the greatest ability to affect outcomes in Asia. So just briefly, the United States' multidimensional relationship in the region has served it well over the years, but many of these are being shaken today in recent months with President Trump's open skepticism of these very ties. And while Beijing has robust economic ties with many of its neighbors, it's undercut its own influence at times by using this leverage in a threatening manner, as we recently saw in South Korea. And more importantly, it hasn't been able to provide answers to the most pressing questions, like what are we going to do about North Korea? So to conclude, my answer is that we don't have a clear winner yet in this competition for leadership. It's ongoing, and at the end of the day, it won't be about which country has the biggest GDP or which one has signed the most security agreements, but it'll be the power that continues to build and maintain quality relationships with others and can provide answers to important challenges like North Korea that will prevail in Asia. Thank you.
Tsunia Watanabe works at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo, a city whose leadership we'll be following closely as they put on the Olympics in 2020, seeing as we're going to be getting them 8 years later. And he's going to talk to us about the perspective of leadership from Japan.
Thank you, Terry. I appreciated your invitation to here again this year. Who will lead Asia? That's a very important question now, particularly. I think the economic prosperity is a really key issue, and to have a sustainable economic prosperity, I think we need a very free society, free trade, free economy, and democracy too. But that's very important things when in the future. And it's a good news is that the Chinese leader, the Xi Jinping, is the speech about the defending free trade, and that's very important. Common interests of all players in Asia, including the United States. And I think that is a very key issue. But at the same time, we really need a stability in the region for the economic growth. So I think future would be the very important stability and the free economy rule. Who's going to lead? Who's make this kind of a situation stable? I think U.S. still need to be the regional power. But at the same time, of course, U.S. seems to be very tired of too much burden. So we need to share with this. Who's going to be the share this kind of role? Of course, all Asian countries, and especially the like-minded country, the security allies, like Japan or South Korea or Australia, very important. But also ASEAN and India and China. I think all players really need to. That is a case of the future. And that's going to be the very hedge against the tired US would leave Asia. I don't think that would happen because I think as long as the economic interests exists, I think US would stay. But also, we need to avoid the unfortunate military rivalry. And also, current North Korean issue suggested if current non-proliferation regime collapse, I think a big trouble is many countries and non-governmental entity may acquire the nuclear. That's going to be the nightmare for all players in the world. So I think still the US is very important, but also Asian countries really need to start sharing with the US for the stability and economic growth in the Asian region. Thank you very much.
Mark Lippert currently works for Boeing, but he's the former US ambassador to South Korea. He left Seoul in January of this year, and he hasn't yet been replaced. Now, given what's going on with North Korea, Mark, I don't know if you can get time off from Boeing, but we need you back in Seoul pretty quickly.
Thanks, Terry. It's an honor to be here, and always good to get back to Seoul, the birthplace of both of my children, and a lot of fond memories there. I'll just start by saying this. It's great to be here in LA. I have a good Korean friend who says most young Koreans growing up in South Korea now think LA is actually part of South Korea. That's so. But let me just make a couple points. I know that North Korea is in the news. We will get to that on the next panel. But a lot of Americans and a lot of Western media come to South Korea and they want to look at South Korea through the North Korean lens. And to be sure, North Korea is an important issue in South Korea. But if you look at it through that lens, you are missing the picture. And what do I mean by that in terms of leadership? Through sheer force of will, through incredible leadership, through an unbelievably strong and unrelenting culture, the South Koreans effectuated the most spectacular democratic and development model in the history of the world over the last 30 years, to rise out of the ashes of the Korean War, to become a top 10 economy and one of the world's great democracies, not to mention a fantastic culture that is exporting its culture around the world. So having said that, South Korea is very much at a crossroads. The economy, a lot of economists say, needs structural reform. The president has undertaken a strong economic program dealing with labor rights and employment, trying to address income inequality. The democracy, I think, is very strong in South Korea, but there's always talk of constitutional reform in South Korea. Why? The South Korean president has 1 5-year fixed term, and there's always been talk of an American style, 2 terms, or trying to strengthen the National Assembly. So the economy, there's questions, very robust and good questions to have. Democracy, there's always a robust debate around that. And obviously the region. The South Koreans live in a tough neighborhood. Russia, China, North Korea, Japan. South Korea has always said a shrimp surrounded by whales, right? And if you took South Korea and actually dropped them in Europe, they'd actually be quite a big country. But they're in a really tough neighborhood, and sometimes I think the neighborhood can cause South Koreans to get a little down on themselves or think the world is a really, really tough place. Let me just close on saying on this, though, having said that, even though they're in a tough neighborhood, even though they've got questions about their economy, even though there are always very valid questions about where do they go next in terms of democratic development, the future is bright in South Korea. It's bright because there is a strong cadre of political leaders. It's bright because it has some of the best human capital in the world. It's bright because of the strong infrastructure, and it's bright because of the Korean people who are unrelenting, dedicated, and will persevere to overcome almost any adversity. I will stop there. Thank you.
Anne Kokas is at the University of Virginia, where she teaches media studies. And she's also just written a book called Hollywood Made in China. And so she understands better than anyone how the Hollywood Dream Factory will combine with the China Dream to change entertainment in Asia forever. Anne.
Thank you, Terry. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in Los Angeles, where I did my PhD and much of my field work. And today what I want to do is look at 3 leadership challenges for one relationship, for the Sino-US relationship, and looking at leadership challenges that we're facing in the media, entertainment, and technology industries. So the US and China are in a position of increased negotiation, as well as a period of rapid change. So we're seeing the US-China film quota being renegotiated from 34 films to potentially a higher number. We're also seeing shifts in Chinese distribution practices. So with China's new film promotion law, we're seeing a change in the types of cast and crew that can shoot films within China. So looking at those cast and crew carrying socialist core values with them. We're also seeing this movement toward an increase in digital content becoming a greater source of revenue for the film industry. So looking at IP across platforms and gaming, as well as VR, AI, and this becomes an increasing challenge when we're looking at the U.S.-China relationship, because as we see this growth of China's film market, we're also seeing the growth of parallel digital industries. And whereas in the film market, we see that China did allow some Hollywood engagement within the digital landscape, these questions of data storage, of technology transfer become even more challenging. So what I'm looking at now in the future of my research, and what I think one of the key leadership challenges that we're facing, is this question of how cybersecurity policy and data security will begin to intersect with the very real market entry strategy challenges that Hollywood studios and that Silicon Valley are facing in the near term. Now, this becomes an increasing challenge as China incorporates even stricter regulations for requiring data localization with the 2017 cybersecurity law, requiring companies like Apple to store their data with joint ventures. Now, what this ultimately means is this gives China a leg up on establishing new standards, on establishing the terms of the digital economy in the 21st century. This is an issue of great concern in DC, as we're seeing increased legislation on examining Chinese acquisitions of US media and technology companies through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US. But also it becomes a really interesting long-term strategic challenge for the US to look at China's long-term media and data security planning policy in relation to our own policies, which tend to be much more focused on a short term. So how over the next 10, 15, 20 years, are we able to establish, is the US able to establish a strong framework in the digital economy? So thank you very much, and I am very excited to talk with all of you tomorrow about Hollywood and China.
By the way, for those of you who can't see, we do have somebody down here keeping time, and he's putting up time placards for people. So congratulations to all our speakers for keeping to your 3 minutes. I realize it's quite intimidating. Lê Quoc Minh runs the new media technologies, runs all new media technologies for the Vietnam News Agency in Hanoi. And as anyone who's been to Vietnam recently and seen how addicted young Vietnamese are to social media, you'll understand that he's a very busy person.
Many people have been talking about politics, so I'm talking about something else, journalism. I've been traveling around the world for the last 30 years, and from time to time, I was asked a very simple question: is the war still going on in Vietnam? I don't know why people keep asking me the same question, although this war stopped 40 years ago. Even in this brochure, the 2 pages talking about Southeast Asia, all data as about Singapore, Myanmar, Cambodia, Philippines, but no words about Vietnam. I think the lack of information may lead to misunderstanding, even conflict, or even wars. I've been attending many European, Asian journalist meetings, and we keep arguing about the why so many topics in Europe was covered by the media, but not the Asian topics. And now we came to a situation when we are flooded with news all over the internet. And all the media, even in Vietnam, cover sensational headlines, shocking crime, sex stories. I think these things are not good as well. Too much information is as bad as the lack of information. So we think that constructive journalism and responsible journalism will make a very good contribution for the stable society of Asia in the future. Thank you.
Andrew Okun is head of the American Go Association, and Go is a game that's known only to a rarefied few here in the United States, but of course is followed fanatically in China, South Korea, I guess North Korea, also in Japan. And so we asked him today to talk a little bit about the enormous shock that went through the entire Go community earlier this year when an artificial intelligence program called DeepMind beat the world's #1 Go player, Kuan Yew, from China in May. Andrew.
Thank you, Terry, and thanks for the invitation. No picture? I guess not. Oh, there it is. For those of you who don't know, Go is a board game originating in China more than 2,000 years ago. Played all over the world, but especially, as Terry said, in China, Japan, and Korea, where it has the status of a professional sport. If you look at the picture, you can see it's played 2 players on a 19 by 19 board. One has black stones, one white. They alternate putting stones on the intersections of the board. If a stone or group of stones is surrounded, it's captured, and at the end, the player whose stones cover or surround a larger part of the board wins. Very simple rules, but Go has an extraordinary level of depth and complexity to it. Good players try to think many moves ahead, but they also have to use intuition, rules of thumb, proverbs, and other kinds of informal knowledge and judgment to play well. The size of the game and the need for intuition made computer Go a major challenge and an unsolved problem of AI until last year. Despite many incremental advances, for 20 years after Deep Blue beat Kasparov at chess, Go software never approached a top pro. Google's DeepMind unit announced a software called Alphago at the start of 2016. It uses deep neural networks as well as Monte Carlo tree search to generate and evaluate moves, and the first version beat a mid-level pro less than 2 years after the start of the project. In March of 2016, the next version beat the legendary Isedol 9-dan by 4-1 in a challenge match in Seoul that turned into a massive media event. By the end of 2016, an online version had beaten all the world's top players, and in May this year, as Terry said, a new version defeated the current world #1, Ke Naidan, in Wuzhen, China. It's clear now that the fourth game of the Lee Sedol challenge match in Seoul was the last time a human being will beat a strong AI at Go. It was 3 months earlier than this. A really smart machine learning engineer I know predicted it was still 10 or 20 years away. In July this year, China's State Council announced a plan for China to be world leader in AI by 2030. It seems likely to me that this was partly because the Lee Sedol match in Korea was a bit of a wake-up call and a little embarrassing. It's a Chinese game, they have the best players, they're seeking leadership in tech. The challenge match in Seoul a year ago was watched by 60 million people in China alone. The 2017 match in Wuzhen was a big event too, but at the last minute, the domestic coverage in China was dropped. It was hard for Go players in China to watch the matches live, which suggests a little sensitivity. The main lesson of Go, to my mind, is that the new techniques, especially deep neural networks, can produce powerful results shockingly faster and cheaper than prior AI methods, and not just because of better hardware. The lesson resembles that of the atomic bomb. The A-bomb was not important because it could level a city, but because it could do it quickly and cheaply. The methods that let Alphago leap ahead in skill every few months for 2 years at a previously unbeatable game can be aimed at a lot of problems and produce results fast. And China is not going to leave that on the table.
We'll be hearing more about artificial intelligence in Asia tomorrow. There's one particular panel on Shenzhen and Silicon Valley, which I think will be interesting. Our final speaker, Shashi Jai Kumar, heads the Center for Excellence for National Security in Singapore, and indeed Singapore's national security is very excellent, as any of you have been. He is also one of the authors of The Big Ideas of Lee Kuan Yew, and I believe that book was named in that way because they couldn't find any small ideas of Lee Kuan Yew. He will talk to us about the perspective of leadership from one of Southeast Asia's smallest but most outspoken countries.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Terry. So Singapore is another small shrimp country. We have quite a unique leadership model in Singapore where, as Terry reminds me recently, the Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, is paid $1.7 million annual salary, which is more than the combined wages of the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK combined. So commensurately, besides the political leadership, the civil servants, the public officers are paid among the highest paid in the world. The best and the brightest have to go into politics and public policy making, the civil service politics. Without this, the nation fails. We have no other resource. These leaders are microscopically and ruthlessly tested out in a very meritocratic system. Well, what are they good for? One aspect, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about it because it's less well known, is the coming together, and when I was in government, I was involved in these every 4 or 5 years, for very long-term visionary scenario planning exercises where we get together, we look at the state of play in the nation, society, what it means for us, what the driving trends and forces are, what the world will be like 15, 20 years down the line. This is an important visioning, not just for black swans, but for black elephants. What's a black elephant? It's a cross between a black swan and the elephant in the room. Black elephant is the problem black elephant is a problem that's visible to everybody, but no one wants to deal with it. You pretend it's not there. You hope it will go away. When it blows up, it is a problem. We all feign surprise, believing that it's actually a black swan, but it's not. And I'll give you an example, perhaps the key example, and this is my second point now. We live in a world, and Southeast Asia sees this, where there's a growing tolerance for intolerance. Movements that were once fringe ideological ideas are starting to shunt aside previously cosmopolitan, pluralistic traditions and cultures. This is becoming not just a terrorism problem. Security services in my part of the world are reasonably good at arresting people. I'm talking about extreme cases where cultures and syncretic movements which have existed for centuries are just being pushed aside in the name of hate speech. What we need is an aggressive and muscular defense of pluralistic values and tolerance, and this will become increasingly important in societies which seek to be networked, smart nations. Information, rumor, fake news blend in and are disseminated seamlessly in these kinds of societies. So Singapore and countries which seek to be leaders of growth will have to be underlyingly hardwired for resilience. My final point is that I'm not suggesting for a moment here that this resilience means big government. What I'm suggesting is that governments of the future will have to take a troubled world and instill a sense of normalcy and decency. Singapore itself is changing, but not pretending it has all the answers. A reminder of the famous author who once said, for everything to remain the same, everything has to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a little bit of time for questions, and you have 10 targets there. We've started 10 different subject matters. So we have some folks here with microphones. If you want to put up your hand and ask a question, we'll get to you. Christian, I think there's someone right here at the front. Can we get this going? Thank you.
Oh, hello. Hello, my name's Laura Anderson, and I just thought some of your comments on the strategic importance of Australia. So maybe as it relates to defense and nuclear.
Who would you like me to address that?
Probably, yeah, I think maybe on defense strategy and nuclear, a little bit perhaps on, yeah, probably around defense strategy.
Anyone want to take Australia on?
Yeah, well, you know, so India went out of its way, as did Japan in the mid-2000s, to reach out to Australia and try and create a quadrilateral of countries, without mentioning ever the word China, of course, but a quadrilateral that just happened to, you know, surround China. And then the government changed in Australia, and the quadrilateral went away, and it wasn't Japan, the US, or India that did anything about this. The truth is that going forward, if Australia wants to be a strategic player in Asia, it has to figure out exactly who its friends are. And I'm afraid it hasn't done that yet. And when it does, India, Japan will be there, I'm sure. But we're still waiting.
Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Young-Sun Park. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University. I have a question to Ambassador Lippert. Your analysis of the situation in Korean Peninsula seemed to be very optimistic. And I do believe that Korea has done a phenomenal job in trying to lift the country out of poverty, and then they had a remarkable economic success. However, I think that the view inside of Korea is not that much optimistic, and I wonder that who would you pick that if in this particular moment of crisis, whose leadership would be the most desirable or sought to in order to solve the problems that the Korean Peninsula is facing now?
I mean, an individual?
U.S., China, or because they seem to rely too much on the Chinese leadership. So in terms of these, you know, the major powers surrounding Korean Peninsula, who do you think that should play the largest role? Because we haven't seen much progress in terms of that China's the leadership or leverage influence over North Korea.
On North Korea, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see you sort of blended South Korea and North Korea together. Yeah, no, I mean, let me just explain my first comment, my presentation on South Korea, which is, look, in South Korea, there are times when South Koreans express pessimism, and I think it's important for South Koreans to take a step back and look at what they've accomplished and look at the tremendous resources, determination that they have. And you know, the one thing that I remind South Koreans is that when I go around the world, or when I went around the world with Secretary Hagel, especially when I was his chief of staff in the Pentagon, I can't tell you how many developing countries asked me, how did the South Koreans do it? What's their secret? How did their country was destroyed after the Korean War, and they are now a model for the rest of the developing world. So that's why what I'm saying. I'm not saying there aren't real problems. I'm not saying that there aren't really tough challenges ahead. But what I am saying is that there is a lot to be, I think, optimistic about, and that there is a track record of tremendous accomplishment in South Korea. So let me just break, go to the next subject on North Korea. Look, I think it's going to take a combined effort, quite frankly, by multiple powers. I think China, the US, obviously South Korea are at the core of any solution with the North Koreans. But each has something that the North Koreans want. I think on China, they have the economic leverage. The South Koreans, obviously the inter-Korean channel. And the US, there's always been an interest. One, in the North Koreans, they've always wanted to talk to the US. And two, the US military is the most powerful military in the world and is there in large numbers in the Western Pacific. So I think it's going to take a combined effort by that core, but not limited to that core. It's going to have to go beyond that, include the UN Security Council, other members of the six-party talks. So I think it really is, and that's what makes the problem challenging and hard, because it is going to take a lot of effort. It is going to take a lot of coordination. We'll stop there.
Thanks, and we'll have another hour on North Korea after this panel. Over there, thanks.
Hi, Jeff Wasserstrom, a China historian. I wanted to address the question of the last speaker, because I found myself nodding along to your wonderful analysis of the black elephant in the room, or one of them. Climate change would be another one. But the one that you identified is absolutely true. I don't immediately think of Singapore as a model for robust free speech, even though some of the things Singapore has done fits in with a response to this. There are also ways at which China, the place that I pay the most attention to, has taken some ideas from things that were working in Singapore and tweaked them to actually be part of a move toward a very illiberal turn there. So I'm just wondering how things like control of the internet and Singapore fit into your analysis of going forward from here.
Yeah, it's true, because I work besides on the issue of radicalization terrorism on Singapore society politics and the ruling People's Action Party as well. That's one of my areas of study. Every time when we look at the party, it's amazing the number of times we see Chinese cadres, delegations in Singapore itself to study the ruling government and the People's Action Party as well. I think sometimes in Singapore we make the mistake of assuming that China wants to learn from Singapore in so many respects. That may well have been the case economically in the 1990s and early 2000s. But I think I'm coming around to my point of view is that China is simply looking at many models, and Singapore is potentially one of those models. China also studies quite closely what's happening in Europe as well. There's a big dichotomy between media control in Singapore versus China. I used to deal with these issues when I was in government and the information ministry, and I'm not sure what the perceptions of information control are here in this room about Singapore, but actually we operate a very, very liberal internet and web regime. There are certain proscribed websites, XXX, Reader, Playboy, Black House and all that, but even government officials there are quite clear and say, we ban these 100 sites, it's technically 100, we ban them just to show them we can do so. Yeah, and I think that's the big difference between China, which is insisting on all these kinds of measures that other speakers were talking about just now in terms of joint JV, and you want the content actually to be hosted in the country and all that. We don't do this. In fact, we make a point of hosting the key regional outfits, Facebook, Google HQs in Singapore, just to let them know that we want them and we need them. Where I would come across to your ground is to say that when it comes to hate speech or content which is denigrative of any particular race, religion, or creed, we come down very, very hard indeed. And what I didn't have time to say just now during my remarks is that there are strong signs that this will be further tightened under the various laws which have to do with the maintenance of religious harmony. And we come down using high-profile, high-signature legislation, including the Sedition Act, and sometimes, in extreme cases, detention without trial. It's a wonderful relic of what the British colonizers left us. When they left us, they did away with that law, but we kept it. No, I'm not suggesting you try that here.
Thank you. David.
Carl with Get Global. I have two brief questions, if I may. First, two of the speakers talked about the evolution of digital technologies. I'm wondering, is technological evolution changing the essence of national and regional leadership? The second question is to Mr. Jayakumar. Interesting comments. I'm wondering what the causes of the challenges that you see for the cosmopolitan world order. What is causing these challenges, and how do you see these challenges playing out?
So I'd like to thank you for that question, because because of reasons of time, I focus primarily on the U.S. and China, and that's where my research lies. But absolutely, we're definitely seeing the move toward data localization policies. So countries encouraging encouraging the servers to be hosted in the local environment so that government officials can have greater oversight. This is also something that we see in the US. This isn't just a China issue. I mean, but what is really interesting in the Chinese context, we see even evolving national security language, like this notion of cyber sovereignty, the idea of the nation state extending into cyberspace, and there being kind of discrete borders of the nation state. And we see this also in places like Russia and Iran. But when it becomes really interesting is looking at the US-China case, we can actually see a model in some ways for other countries because of the size of China's model, they're able to actually execute a lot more of these strategies more broadly and more quickly. So I think it's actually a really interesting place to look for the future of the evolution of digital nationalism or techno-nationalism.
So a couple of points here, and I don't think we have that much time, so just briefly. The security threat in Singapore has traditionally been seen as a terrorism, radicalization threat, and major plots were uncovered by Al-Qaeda offshoots soon after 9/11. They were foiled. All the security planning looks at the preventing of these kinds of plots, and we foiled quite a few. Much more recently, you have homegrown, non-Al-Qaeda, non-ISIS, self-radicalized guys coming up. They can't get to Syria, Iraq, no problem, we take kitchen knives and kill local politicians. These have been foiled as well. That's not actually where the action is, in my view. That's not the interesting stuff. The interesting stuff is very, very far upstream, fueled by social media, increasingly sectarian points of view, where people are talking on their own echo chambers. They're so happy in these echo chambers. Everyone's agreeing with you. On the left or on the right, there are these other chambers, but these guys are takfiri, deviationists, because they happen not to agree with you. In the old days, before social media came along, I don't like you, I don't agree with you, at least I'm in the room, I still find you unpleasant, but there's some other intelligence which I have to grapple with. This guy's a fellow Singaporean, completely different race, creed, religion, but I have to deal with you in the same room. So I think when the history of social media in our time is eventually written in 20, 30 years, the internet, social media particularly, will have a lot to answer for because it's not proved to be this greater platform for the greater communion of mankind.
Take just one more because we've got our North Korea panel coming up. I think you had one right here at the front.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Listen, thank you all for your thoughts and observations and insights and sharing them with us. A couple of observations on my side is one, the importance of women and having strong female voices. So thank you, Patricia and Aynne, obviously, for representing those. It's really important for the future of Asia. The second thing is Indonesia. I'd really welcome thoughts and comments on its strategic positioning, its large population size, and growing middle class. So,
who wants to take Indonesia? I'm guessing you, Shashi. Does anyone else have anything on Indonesia? Okay, you're back on.
Very, very briefly on Indonesia. This is the point I was trying to make. Indonesia has an overwhelmingly Muslim population, but by tradition, it's been completely unlike the kind of Islam you see practiced in the Gulf in Saudi Arabia. Syncretistic, tolerant, that their national motto, Pancasila, is unity in diversity. Increasingly, as a result of Salafi Wahhabist influence, this is stretching back 30, 40 years, the mass base is becoming increasingly tolerant. Most of the mass base will never tip over into violent extremism, but even if you have 0.05 or 0.02%, that's actually a huge number, relatively speaking. If you were following at all the fairly recent news on the imbroglio over the Jakarta governor impeachment for blasphemy, that actually on the face of it has nothing whatsoever to do with terrorism, but it has everything to do with the future shape and form of Indonesia as a tolerant, cosmopolitan, pluralistic country. The mass base within that, you have the middle, the silent, quiet middle, who should be speaking up, but they're not. They're just too afraid. And here, when I'm talking this way, I'm actually not just talking about Indonesia, I'm talking about many, many other parts of the world. The arresting people, even the Indonesians have got much better at it since the Bali 1 and Bali 2 bombings. The upstream, slow burn, boil frog issues, I'm not just saying the Indonesians, are still not so good at it.
I told you Singapore talks above its meeting weight, but well done. Thank you, Shashi, and thank you for all your questions. We're going to go straight into the North Korea panel. A big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much for all your views.